Sometimes life gives you a choice you can't win. Save the person you love, or live with a choice that will haunt you for the rest of your days. Caleb McKinnon figured he'd seen every kind of tough the Montana wilderness could throw at him. He was wrong. A corrupt judge handed him the devil's own bargain: marry his own sister Sarah, or watch her hang from the gallows. With her life hanging by a thread, Caleb signed the paper. He took her high into the mountains, to the isolated cabin he called home, hoping to just survive the winter. But up there, where the rules of the world below didn't seem to reach, something else began to grow. Something that started as a desperate act of survival was turning into a connection so powerful, neither of them could deny it. It was a love that should never have been possible, and it would either be their salvation or their ruin. The autumn wind howled down the valley, a blade sharpened on stone. It carried the first promise of winter, the smell of pine and dying leaves. Caleb McKinnon stood on the edge of his land, watching the last of the aspens give up their gold to a hard Montana sky. He was 34 years old. 15 of those years he'd spent in these mountains, learning their secrets, their rhythms, their dangers. He'd built a life of solitude, a world he could control. He never imagined that world could be shattered by a single piece of paper. The leather journal under his arm felt heavy. For 15 years it had been his companion. Inside were his notes on weather patterns, on the migration of the elk, on the best places to set his traps when the snows came. It was a book of survival, but today the weight wasn't from the ink and paper. It was from the knowledge that his carefully ordered world was about to be torn apart. Sarah was on the porch when he walked up. She didn't look up, but he saw her fingers whirring the silver locket that had been their mother's. It was one of the only things she'd been allowed to keep. Judge Blackwood's men had dragged her from her little room above the bakery in Copper Creek, her hands still dusted with flour. Inside that locket was a tiny faded picture of Mary McKinnon, a woman whose smile had been the only sun in their hard childhood before consumption took her. Sarah was only 6 then. "You're thinking too hard again," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, the way it had been since they were kids. But years of trying to make herself small, to be invisible in a town that didn't know what to do with an independent woman, had worn the edges off it, made it almost a whisper. Caleb sat on the step next to her. She shifted to make room, but kept a careful, deliberate distance between them. It had been 3 days. 3 days since Judge Blackwood had held his 6th ceremony in his chambers. 3 days since Caleb had signed the paper that made Sarah his wife. They were still figuring out how to breathe the same air without choking on the impossibility of it all. "Thinking about winter," he said. It wasn't a lie, not really. The high meadows were already white with frost. He figured they had 6 weeks, maybe, before the first big snow cut them off from the world. 6 weeks to figure out how a brother and a sister were supposed to be husband and wife. 6 weeks to survive a lie that was keeping one of them alive. Sarah's fingers closed tight around the locket. "Do you ever wonder what she would think?" she asked. Caleb knew who she meant. Their mother, Mary, had a way of making the world seem manageable. Even after their father died in the mine collapse, she'd held them together. She worked her fingers to the bone-washing miners' clothes, mending their shirts, all while teaching her 2 children to read from the one book she owned, a collection of poems by a man named William Blake. She'd probably quote Blake at us, Caleb said, and for the first time in days, Sarah almost smiled. "Something about innocence and experience," she whispered, her voice taking on the same gentle rhythm their mother used to use by the fire. "How do you know but every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight, closed by your senses 5? They fell silent, lost in the memory of a woman whose only dream had been for her children to be safe and happy. The irony was a bitter pill. Sarah's safety now depended on a piece of paper that would have broken their mother's heart. Judge Horace Blackwood was a patient man, a snake coiled in the grass. He understood that real power in the territories wasn't about votes or titles. It was about land. For 3 years, he'd been squeezing homesteaders off their claims. He'd used trumped-up charges, impossible fines, strategic foreclosures. Then he'd sell the land to big mining companies from back east, lining his pockets with gold. Sarah's only crime was that she saw something she wasn't supposed to see. She was delivering bread to the territorial office and overheard Blackwood selling off the Hendricks farm. Old man Hendricks had just been buried. His wife, Martha, had been found dead 2 days before that, supposedly trampled by her own horse. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Sarah made a mistake, a fatal mistake. She mentioned what she'd heard to Mrs. Patterson at the general store. She didn't know that Mrs. Patterson was Judge Blackwood's sister-in-law. She didn't know the woman was the judge's eyes and ears in town. A week later, Sarah was in jail. Blackwood charged her with theft, with arson, with conspiracy. He produced witnesses, men who swore they saw her near barns that had mysteriously burned down right after the owners refused to sell their land. The evidence was fake. The witnesses were paid. The verdict was decided before the trial even began. Sarah McKinnon was going to hang, and her death would be a warning to anyone else who thought about crossing Judge Blackwood. But the judge hadn't counted on Caleb. Caleb McKinnon wasn't a man who accepted outcomes decided by other people. He rode down from his mountain with two things: his father's Colt Peacemaker and a leather pouch heavy with 15 years' worth of gold dust from his trap lines. The gun was for the judge, if reason failed. The gold was for a different kind of persuasion. Blackwood had leaned back in his big leather chair, a smug look on his face. He knew he held all the cards. "You want the girl, Mr. McKinnon?" he'd asked, his voice slick with false courtesy. "Well, the law does provide for alternative sentences." The alternative was marriage. Not to Blackwood, even he had his limits, but to a member of her family, someone who could take legal responsibility for her, keep her out of town, and guarantee she'd never interfere in legitimate business interests again. The fact that Caleb was her brother, in Blackwood's twisted mind, that was just a minor detail. Territorial law was a flexible thing, especially when a man like Blackwood was the one bending it. "You sign the papers," the judge had said, his tone casual, like he was discussing a sale of livestock. "You take her up to that mountain of yours and you keep her quiet. She stays quiet. She stays alive. She causes me one more bit of trouble, and I will find a way to bring her back down here and finish what I started. Are we clear?" Caleb had signed, and now, 3 days later, they were living inside that signature. The cabin, which had always felt like a sanctuary, was now a cage. It was built for one man's solitude, not for two people dancing around an unspoken truth. Sarah had claimed the small alcove where Caleb usually stored his traps and furs, hanging a blanket for a door. Caleb slept on the floor by the fire. He told himself it was practical. The fire needed tending. He was lying to himself. During the day, they moved around each other like ghosts. Sarah was surprisingly good at mountain life. She knew how to split kindling without asking for help. She could coax a fire to life even in the damp morning air. She seemed to know which roots were good to eat and which berries would kill you. "Ma taught me thing," she'd said that morning, her hands steady as she cleaned the rabbits from his traps. "Said a woman needs to know how to take care of herself." Their mother had been a practical woman. She taught Sarah to shoot, to hunt, to read the clouds. But she'd also taught her about rules, moral lines that separated people from the beasts they hunted. They never spoke about where those lines were now. The evenings were the worst. The work was done. The vast, crushing darkness of the mountains pressed in on the little cabin. There was nothing to do but sit by the fire and feel the weight of everything they couldn't say. They talked about supplies, about fixing the leak in the roof, about where to set the trap lines once the deep snows came. They didn't talk about how her presence filled the small space, how her scent of lavender soap and wood smoke was everywhere. They didn't talk about how the cabin no longer felt like his refuge, but like a prison cell they shared. They didn't talk about the dreams that woke them both in a cold sweat, or the moments their eyes met across the flickering firelight and something passed between them that had nothing to do with being brother and sister. On that third night, Caleb watched her mending one of his shirts. The firelight played across her face, catching the curve of her cheek, the line of her throat. And he realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that the little girl he remembered was gone. In her place was a woman whose quiet strength ran deeper than the mountain rivers, whose grace could shatter a man's soul without her even trying. And that realization scared him more than any grizzly, more than any blizzard. Because it meant Judge Blackwood's sick punishment might be working. It might be leading them down a path from which there was no coming back. The ceremony in Judge Blackwood's chambers had been a disgusting farce. The judge's clerk, a nervous little man with ink-stained fingers, was the only witness. Blackwood had read the words with a smirk on his face, enjoying his own cruelty. "Do you, Caleb McKinnon, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" His voice had been thick with amusement. Caleb's "I do" was a raw sound, ripped from his throat. His eyes were locked on Sarah's face, so pale and still she looked like a porcelain doll. Sarah's own reply was a whisper he barely heard. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana," Blackwood had boomed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He'd smiled then, a cold, dead thing. "You may kiss the bride, Mr. McKinnon." The moment had stretched into an eternity. Caleb had leaned forward, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as they cupped her face. He'd kissed her forehead, a gesture of protection, not passion, an act of love for his sister, not his wife. It was the only rebellion he had left. The ride up the mountain had been silent. They'd ridden these trails 1,000 times as kids, racing their ponies through the summer meadows. Now, every familiar twist and turn felt alien, charged with a new, terrible meaning. They were riding toward a future that was a complete unknown. "I can sleep in the stable," Caleb had said when they finally reached the cabin, the sun bleeding crimson and gold across the peaks. "Don't be foolish," Sarah had answered, her voice trembling just a little. "It's going to snow. I can see it in the clouds." She was right. The air had that sharp, clean bite that came before the first real snowfall. But the weather was the least of their problems. They were avoiding the real issue. Married people were supposed to share a bed. That first night, they'd kept an awkward truce. Sarah disappeared behind her blanket curtain. Caleb sat by the fire, pretending to write in his journal, taking long pulls from a bottle of whiskey. His entry for that night was short, just the facts. Temperature dropping. Check trap lines tomorrow. Sarah's safe. But as he stared into the flames, he knew safety was more than just a roof over her head. It was more complicated than keeping her from a hangman's noose. And he had no idea how to keep her safe from this. The nightmares began on the second night. Her scream tore him from a shallow sleep. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand grabbing the rifle from the mantel before he was fully awake. But the danger wasn't outside. It was inside the cabin, inside Sarah's head. "Sarah," he called softly through the blanket. "You're safe. You're home." The crying stopped. He could hear her trying to catch her breath. "I dreamed I was back in that cell," she finally said, her voice small and broken in the darkness. "I could smell the damp stone, and I could hear them, building the gallows right outside my window." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen Blackwood's jail. It was a root cellar under the territorial office, a place not fit for animals. That she had survived 3 weeks in that hole was a miracle. "That's over now," he said, moving closer to the blanket but not touching it. "Blackwood can't touch you up here." "Can't he?" Her question was heavy with a fear that went deeper than nightmares. "We're not really married, Caleb. Not in God's eyes. What happens when he gets bored of this game? What happens when someone finds out that we're—" She couldn't say the words. What happens when they find out we're brother and sister? The question hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. Territorial law was whatever a powerful man said it was. Today their marriage served Blackwood's purpose. Tomorrow it could be the very thing that got them both hanged. "We'll face it when it comes," Caleb said, his voice more confident than he felt. "But tonight, you're safe. That's all that matters." The third night, the scream came again. This time he didn't hesitate. He pushed the blanket aside and knelt by her narrow cot. She was thrashing, fighting enemies that weren't there. He put his hands on her shoulders gently. "Sarah, I'm here." Her eyes flew open, wild with terror. Then recognition dawned, and the fight went out of her. Without thinking, she reached for him. Her arms went around his neck, and she buried her face in his shoulder, sobbing. He held her. He just held her as she trembled, one of his hands stroking her dark hair, the other rubbing circles on her back. She smelled of lavender and wood smoke, the scents of their childhood. But now they felt dangerous. Her body was warm and soft against his. He tried to ignore it. He tried to tell himself this was just comfort. Just a brother protecting his sister. But Sarah wasn't a little girl anymore, and the line between comfort and something else was getting thinner with every breath he took. I keep thinking about Ma, she whispered against his chest. What would she say? Their mother had been a woman of black and white, of right and wrong. Family was sacred. The love between a brother and sister was pure, protective. It was never supposed to feel like this. She'd say we did what we had to do, Caleb said, but the words felt like a lie. Would she? Sarah pulled back, her eyes searching his in the dim firelight. Or would she say that some things are worse than dying? The question was a punch to the gut. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her their mother would have understood, but he couldn't. Honesty was the one thing they had always had. I don't know, he admitted, his voice raw, but I know she would want you to live, no matter the cost. Sarah's hand came up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Her touch was so tender, it stole his breath. And what do you want, Caleb? What did he want? He wanted to turn back time. He wanted to find another way. He wanted to wake up from this nightmare. Or, and this was the thought that truly terrified him, did he want to stop fighting? Did he want to admit that holding her like this felt more like coming home than his own cabin ever had? I want you to be safe, he said. It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Her smile was sad and full of a knowledge that mirrored his own fear. That's not what I asked. The air in the cabin was suddenly too thick to breathe. It was charged with unspoken words, with dangerous possibilities. Caleb pulled away, his hands lingering on her shoulders for a heartbeat too long. Get some sleep, he said, his voice rough. He went back to his spot by the fire, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. The warmth of her body still clung to him. The memory of her fingers on his face was burned into his skin, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the greatest danger to Sarah wasn't Judge Blackwood. It was him. The chess set was something Caleb had carved 3 winters ago, out of boredom and the need to keep his hands busy. Pine for the pawns, oak for the kings and queens. It was a way to pass the long, snowbound nights. Now, it was their ritual. Every evening, after their quiet supper, Sarah would set up the board. It was a way to fill the silence, a way to be together without having to talk about what was really happening between them. Your move, she said, her eyes focused on the board. She played with a quiet intensity that surprised him. He'd taught her the game when she was a kid, but she'd become a formidable opponent. He moved his knight, setting a trap. She saw it instantly, and with a simple move of her bishop, turned his own trap against him. Where'd you learn to play like that? He asked. Mrs. Carmichael at the boarding house, and she said, her fingers resting on the wooden piece. She was a teacher from Boston. She's the one who encouraged me to start my bakery. Said a woman needed to be able to stand on her own 2 feet. It was the most she'd said about her life in town. For 8 years, she'd just been a memory to him, the girl who'd waved goodbye as he rode off to the mountains. Now he was hungry for every detail of the woman she'd become. What was it like? He asked. In town. Her laugh was brittle with no humor in it. Lonely, she said simply. The wives thought an unmarried woman running a business was suspicious. The unmarried men thought she was available. Mrs. Patterson was the only one who really befriended me. She moved her queen, putting his king in check. And we know how that turned out. The bitter irony hung between them. The one friend she'd made had been the one to betray her. I'm sorry, Caleb said, and he meant it more than he could say. Don't be, she said, her eyes meeting his across the board. If none of that had happened, I'd still be in that tiny room, wondering if that was all my life was ever going to be. He searched her face in the firelight, trying to understand. And now? Now I don't know what my life is going to be, she said, her voice soft but steady. But at least I'm not alone. The words landed between them like stones in a quiet pool. Not alone. After years of solitude, he knew exactly how much that meant. Check, she said quietly. He'd been so lost in her words, he hadn't even seen it coming. The next morning, the trap lines needed checking. The air was sharp, promising the first heavy snow. Caleb had planned to go alone, but Sarah met him at the door, dressed for the trail. I'm coming with you, she said. It wasn't a request. It's a long ride, he argued. The trails are rough. Then you'll need someone watching your back, she shot back. Besides, if I'm going to live up here, I need to learn the way. She was right. If something happened to him, she'd be alone. She had to be able to survive. They rode out at dawn. Sarah handled her horse with an easy confidence, her dark hair braided down her back. She wore a practical split skirt, riding astride like a man, something that would have caused a scandal in town, but made perfect sense in the mountains. Tell me about the traps, she said, and he found himself teaching her, explaining how to read the tracks, how to approach a snare without leaving a human scent. She listened intently, asking smart questions, her mind working, learning. At the second trap site, he let her take the lead. Your turn. She dismounted and moved with a careful, deliberate grace. The trap held a rabbit. He saw her face pale for a second, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. But then she squared her shoulders and did what needed to be done, her movements quick and efficient. It gets easier, he said quietly. Does it? She asked, holding the rabbit with a strange tenderness. Or do you just learn not to think about it? Both, maybe, he admitted. By midday, they shared a meal of dried meat and hard bread by a stream. Sarah sat on a log, her face turned up to the weak sun. Caleb found himself just watching her, the way the light caught the auburn strands in her hair, the elegant line of her throat. It's so quiet up here, she said, her eyes still closed. I'd forgotten. Quiet's not the same as silent, he said. Listen. She tilted her head and he saw her expression change as she began to hear it. The whisper of the wind in the pines, the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of a squirrel in the undergrowth, the mountain's secret music. I miss this, she said. In town, there was always noise. I forgot what it was like to hear the world breathe. As they rode back to the cabin that afternoon, Caleb realized something had changed. Working together, side by side, had forged a new kind of bond between them. It felt less like a forced arrangement and more like a partnership. He found himself wondering if this was what a real marriage was supposed to feel like. Not the flowery romance from novels, but this quiet understanding, this easy rhythm, the feeling of finally having someone to share the silence with. And that thought terrified him more than anything. Sarah's little sewing box sat on the table by the fire. Inside were spools of thread, needles, and a tiny pair of scissors that had belonged to their mother. She was mending a tear in his shirt, her fingers moving with a practiced grace. They had settled into a routine. He hunted and trapped. She cooked and managed the cabin. It should have felt normal. Instead, it felt like they were two children playing house, pretending to be adults, all while a storm gathered just over the horizon. Tell me about the war, she said suddenly. Her needle stopped. Caleb's hands froze on the rifle he was cleaning. He never talked about the war. The 3 years he'd spent in the Union Army were a part of his life he kept locked away. Why? He asked. She put her sewing down. Because you came back with scars that weren't there before. Because sometimes I hear you pacing in the middle of the night. Because I want to know the man you are now, not just the boy I remember. Her honesty was a blade that cut through his defenses. He looked down at the rifle in his hands. It was ugly, he said. Just men killing other men for reasons that stopped making sense after the first year. Is that why you came up here? To get away? He nodded. The mountains don't lie. They're dangerous, but they're honest. What was the worst part? She asked, her voice soft. The question hung in the air. He found himself remembering things he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. The smell of blood and gunpowder. The sound of 1,000 men screaming. Shiloh, he said quietly. April of '62. He told her everything. About the surprise attack at dawn, the 2 days of brutal, chaotic fighting, the friends he'd watched die. He told her about the piece of shrapnel that had torn through his shoulder, leaving the long, ugly scar. After the battle, he said, his voice thick, the fighting stopped for a while. The survivors from both sides, we worked together, carrying the wounded from the field. That's when I knew I was done with causes. When you find yourself carrying a dying Confederate boy who's crying for his mother, and you realize he's the same age you remember your little sister being, causes don't mean much anymore. He fell silent. Sarah had finished mending the shirt, but she held it in her lap, her fingers stroking the worn fabric. "Is that what I am to you?" she asked softly. "Your little sister?" The question sliced through the careful distance they'd maintained. He looked up. She was watching him, her dark eyes reflecting the fire, her expression anything but sisterly. "I don't know what you are to me," he admitted, the words raw and honest. "I thought I did, but nothing makes sense anymore." She stood up and crossed the room. She knelt beside him on the hearth, so close he could feel the warmth from her skin. So close he could see the tiny frantic pulse beating in her throat. "Show me," she whispered. She reached for his left arm. He flinched, but her touch was gentle, insistent. She pushed up his sleeve, revealing the puckered scar. Her fingers traced its length, and a shiver went through him. Her touch was a fire he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Sometimes," he managed to say, "when the weather changes." Her fingers moved, exploring the smaller scars, each one a story he'd never told. Her touch was no longer just curious. It was a caress. It was a healing he hadn't known he was desperate for. "You've carried all of this alone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was my burden to carry," he said. "Not anymore." Her hands came up to frame his face, her thumbs brushing his cheekbones. His breath caught in his throat. "You don't have to be alone anymore, Caleb." The space between them vanished. He could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. He could feel her breath on his lips, sweet with the mint tea she drank every night. "Sarah," he whispered. It was a prayer. It was a warning. "I know," she said. "I know what we're risking." She didn't pull away. She leaned closer until her forehead rested against his. They stayed like that, balanced on the edge of a cliff, unable to go back, terrified to jump. Finally, she was the one who broke the spell. She pulled away, her movements stiff with effort. She went back to her chair and packed her sewing box with trembling hands. "We should get some sleep," she said, not looking at him. Caleb nodded, his body still humming, his mind reeling. As he watched her disappear behind the blanket, he knew their carefully built walls were crumbling, and he didn't know if he had the strength to build them back up. Caleb's father had left him his Winchester 73, a beautiful, deadly piece of machinery. Thomas McKinnon had taught Caleb to shoot with that rifle, on mornings just like this one, with the frost painting the meadows silver. Now Caleb was teaching Sarah. He stood behind her, his body close to hers, guiding her aim. "Breathe in," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Let half of it out. Squeeze the trigger. Gentle." He could feel the warmth of her through her clothes. He could smell the lavender in her hair. His hands were covering hers on the rifle stock. It felt so natural. It felt so dangerous. "I can't hold it steady," she said, her voice tight with frustration. He moved closer, his chest pressing against her back, helping her support the weight of the gun. "Let me help you find your balance." The moment they touched, a jolt went through them, an electric current that had nothing to do with shooting lessons. He felt her lean back against him, just for a second. Her breath hitched. "Focus on the target," he said, his voice rough. She nodded, but he could feel the wild flutter of her pulse against his arm. The shot went wide. They tried again. And again. With each shot, she got better. But with each correction, each time he had to adjust her stance, the space between them grew smaller, the air thicker. The lesson was breaking down the last of their defenses. "Better," he said after a shot hit the edge of the target. "You're a natural." She turned in his arms to face him, the rifle hanging forgotten between them. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "Ma always said I had steady hands," she said. The mention of their mother should have been a cold shock of reality. But it wasn't. It was just another thread connecting them. "She'd be proud of you," he said softly. Would she? The old question was back, the doubt that haunted them. Or would she be horrified by what we've become? He looked at her, really looked at her. The girl was gone. This was a woman, strong and brave and beautiful. "I think," he said carefully, "she would understand that sometimes you have to make impossible choices to survive." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Is that what this is? Survival?" Before he could answer, she reached up and touched his face. Her fingers were trembling. Because it doesn't feel like survival anymore, she whispered. It feels like... She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she stood on her toes and kissed him. It was soft at first, a question. He could have pulled away. He should have pulled away, but he didn't. He dropped the rifle. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against him, and he kissed her back with all the loneliness and longing of the last 8 years. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Her eyes were wide, a mix of wonder and terror. "Oh," was all she could manage. "Sarah, He started, but she cut him off with another kiss. Fiercer this time. Surer. When they separated again, the world had changed. The mountains, the sun, the sky were all the same. But they had crossed a line. There was no going back. "We can't," he said, but his arms were still locked around her. "Why not?" she asked, her voice fierce. "Because of what people would say? Because of laws made by men like Judge Blackwood? Because you're my sister?" The last words tasted like ash in his mouth. Her smile was sad but strong. "Am I, Caleb? We share no blood. We were raised together, but that doesn't make us brother and sister. Not in the way that matters. And even if it did..." She put her hand on his chest, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. "Even if it did, I would rather have one real day with you than a lifetime of pretending this isn't real." Her words shattered the last of his resistance. He'd been telling himself this was wrong, a sin, a betrayal. But looking at her now, he knew the only betrayal would be to deny this, to deny her, to deny them. "If we do this," he said, his voice low, "there's no turning back. It's us against everyone." "When has our life ever been normal?" she asked. "When have we ever been able to care what other people think?" She was right. They were already outcasts, living a life forced on them by a corrupt judge. Their marriage was already a scandal. What more did they have to lose? "Then we choose each other," he said, the words feeling more true than anything he'd ever said in his life. Her smile was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "We choose each other," she repeated, and she kissed him again, with all the certainty of a woman who had fought for her life and found her home. The rifle lay forgotten in the grass. The mountains stood as silent witnesses. But as Caleb lost himself in the kiss, a cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. They might have chosen each other, but the world below, in Judge Blackwood, had not forgotten them. Their fight was just beginning. The medicine bundle hung by the fire, a small leather pouch full of herbs Caleb had learned about from an old Crow medicine man. Willow bark for fever, yarrow to stop bleeding. Remedies that could mean the difference between life and death this far from any doctor. One November morning, Sarah woke up burning with fever. The night before, she'd been fine, beating him at chess and laughing. Now she was pale and shivering, her breathing shallow and ragged. "It's just a cold," she whispered, her teeth chattering. But Caleb knew better. He'd seen enough sickness during the war. This was serious. He spent the next 3 days fighting for her life. He brewed teas from the willow bark. He sat by her side, bathing her face with cool water. She was delirious, mumbling about their childhood, singing their mother's old lullabies, talking about promises they'd made as kids to always look after each other. On the second night, her fever spiked. She was shivering so violently the whole cot was shaking. Caleb made a decision. He stripped down to his long johns and climbed into the narrow bed beside her. He pulled her against him, wrapping them both in every blanket in the cabin. He told himself it was just for warmth, that he was just trying to save her. But as she instinctively curled against his chest, her feverish body pressed against his, he knew it was more than that. By morning, the fever had broken. She was weak, but she was lucid. She woke up in his arms. She didn't pull away. She just lay there remembering fragments of the night, his voice whispering to her in the darkness, his hands gentle on her skin, the solid, steady presence of him holding her back from the edge. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice hoarse. His eyes snapped open. "How do you feel?" "Better," she said. "Thanks to you." He touched her forehead, his touch professional, checking for any returning heat. But his eyes told a different story. Relief, tenderness, something more. "You scared me," he admitted, his voice quiet. I thought I might lose you. Sarah reached up and touched his face. You won't lose me, she said softly. Not now. Not when we've just found each other. And then she kissed him. It was different this time, slower, deeper. A kiss that acknowledged how close they'd come to losing everything. When they broke apart, the last barrier between them had dissolved into nothing. I love you, she said, the words rushing out. I know it's wrong. I know it's impossible. But I love you, Caleb. Not as a sister, as a woman loves a man. He didn't answer with words. He kissed her again, pouring everything he felt, all the weeks of suppressed desire, all the years of loneliness, into it. When he pulled back, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. I love you too, he said, his voice raw with emotion. God help us, Sarah, but I love you too. That afternoon, as her strength returned, they talked, really talked. For the first time, there were no secrets, no forbidden topics. They had nothing left to lose. What would have happened, she asked, her head resting on his shoulder, if we'd met as strangers? He thought about it for a long time. I think I would have fallen in love with you even faster, he said. But it wouldn't have been the same. This, this is built on something deeper. We know everything about each other. The good, the bad. There are no illusions. That night they made love. It wasn't a desperate, guilty act. It was a slow, tender confirmation of everything they had finally admitted. It was a promise. Afterward, lying tangled in the quilts their mother had made, Sarah traced patterns on his chest. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, pulling her closer. We survive the winter, and we figure out how to build a life. If the world won't accept us, then we'll make our own world. Right here. That might have to be enough, she whispered against his skin. It already is, he answered. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the mountains in a clean, white silence. Inside the cabin, they had made their choice. They had chosen love, even if they believed it was a sin. They had chosen each other. And for now, in their small, isolated world, that was everything. Sarah was looking for a verse in their mother's old book of poems by William Blake. It was the only book in the cabin, and she often read from it in the evenings. As she turned a page, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, fluttered to the floor. Caleb was by the fire, mending a leather harness. He heard her sharp intake of breath and looked up. She was frozen, staring at the paper on the floor as if it were a snake. Her face was as white as the snow outside. What is it? He asked, putting his work aside. She knelt slowly, her hands trembling as she picked it up. I'd forgotten, she whispered. He knelt beside her. He saw the official-looking script, the territorial seal. The words at the top made his own breath catch in his throat. Certificate of Adoption, Territory of Montana. Sarah, what is this? Read it, she said, her voice shaking. Please, just read it. He took the papers. The formal legal language swam before his eyes. The document was dated 23 years ago. The names of the officials were strangers to him. But one name jumped off the page. Sarah Elizabeth Winters, born June 15, 1854, to Margaret and James Winters. Orphaned at age 3. Adopted by Thomas and Mary McKinnon of Copper Creek on September 10, 1857. The papers fell from his numb fingers. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. Sarah wasn't his sister. She had never been his sister. The little girl who had joined their family when he was 7. She wasn't a blood relative. She was an orphan his parents had taken in and raised as their own. So completely, so lovingly, that they had never felt the need to tell either of them the truth. You didn't know, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. No, Caleb breathed, the word getting lost in the shock. They never said a word. I always believed. So did I, she said softly. Until Ma was dying. She was delirious with the fever. She kept talking about my real parents, kept apologizing for not telling me. I thought it was just the fever. But she mentioned these papers, hidden in this book. After she was gone, I pushed it away. It was easier to believe I had misunderstood. Caleb stared at the documents. His entire life. his entire understanding of himself, rearranging in his mind. Every moment of guilt, every night spent wrestling with what he thought was a terrible sin, every ounce of shame. It was all built on a lie, a loving lie, but a lie nonetheless. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "When you remembered?" She looked at him, her eyes full of a deep, sad understanding. "Because when you came for me, when we were forced into this, I was so convinced what we were feeling was wrong. I couldn't let myself hope. The guilt was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that made sense." He gathered the papers, his hands steadier now. The enormity of it was starting to sink in. Their love wasn't just permissible. It had always been permissible. They had been torturing themselves for nothing. "Not for nothing," she said, her hand coming to rest over his heart. "We loved each other even when we believed it was the worst sin imaginable. We were willing to be damned for each other. That means something, Caleb. It means everything." And he knew she was right. This revelation didn't change what they felt. It consecrated it. It made it holy. "All those nights," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "all those times we pulled away from each other. We were being true to our hearts," she finished for him, "even when we thought our hearts were wrong." He set the papers aside and pulled her into his arms. She melted against him, but this time it was different. A tension he hadn't even realized she'd been carrying was gone. She was lighter in his arms, free. "Sarah Winters," he said, trying the name out. She laughed, a sound so bright and clear it filled the small cabin. "It sounds strange. I've been a McKinnon for so long, I forgot I was ever anyone else. And this changes—" "What?" she asked, though her shining eyes told him she already knew. "Everything," he said, "and nothing. We still love each other. We still have to survive. But now—" He paused, the weight of the words hitting him. "Now we can have it all, without shame, without guilt." Her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "We can be married for real," she whispered. "We can have children," he added, the thought a sudden, brilliant explosion in his mind. A family, a real family with no secrets, no shadows. That night they made love with a joy and a freedom that was so new, so profound, it felt like being reborn. Afterward, as they lay wrapped in each other's arms, the future stretched out before them, no longer a dark, terrifying path, but a wide-open meadow. "What do we do first?" she asked. His mind was racing with possibilities that had been unthinkable just that morning. "First," he said, "we're going to have a real wedding. Not Blackwood's mockery, a real one, with vows that we mean." Her eyes filled with happy tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." Outside, the Montana winter could do its worst. Inside, spring had finally arrived. The wanted poster came with the first spring thaw. Old Pete Hendricks, a trapper who lived down the valley, brought it up with the mail. Judge Horace Blackwood's arrogant face stared up from the worn paper, but the words underneath told a new story. Wanted for corruption, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. $500 reward. Caleb read it 3 times before it sank in. "He's finished," Pete said, sipping the hot coffee Sarah had given him. "A new territorial marshal came in from Denver. A man named Crawford. He came with federal authority to clean house. Blackwood was his first target." "What happened to him?" Sarah asked, her voice flat. No sympathy for the man who had almost destroyed her. "Fled," Pete said. "Lit out for California with as much money as he could carry. Left all his cronies behind. They started singing like canaries the second Marshal Crawford put the pressure on." Pete pulled another letter from his saddlebag. "There's more. Marshal Crawford is reviewing every one of Blackwood's rulings. That includes your marriage. And the charges against you, Sarah, they've been officially dropped." Sarah's knees buckled. Caleb caught her, his arms steady around her waist. Free. They were finally, truly free. "So we can dissolve the marriage?" Caleb asked, trying to process it all. "If you want to," Pete said, his shrewd old eyes watching them closely. "Crawford said anyone affected by Blackwood's mess should come into town. Get their legal affairs sorted out." After Pete left, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Everything had changed in the blink of an eye. The adoption papers had freed them from their guilt. This news freed them from the law. "We could start over," Sarah said quietly, her eyes on the wanted poster. "A clean slate. We could go anywhere." "Is that what you want?" Caleb asked. The thought of losing her now, after everything, was a physical pain. The months in this cabin had been the best of his life. He couldn't go back to the loneliness. Sarah looked around the small room that had been their prison and their sanctuary. "I want you," she said, her voice firm. "I want us. But I want a real life, Caleb. Not just hiding, not just surviving. I want to be part of the world again." He understood. This mountain had saved them, but it was also a cage. "You want to go back to town," he said. "I want us to go back to town," she corrected. "As husband and wife. For real this time. By choice." It was their chance. A chance to choose each other. Not out of desperation, but out of love. A chance to face the world together without secrets. "Are you ready for that?" he asked. "The whispers, the stares." Her smile was fierce. "Let them whisper," she said. "We know our truth. Anyone who wants to judge us can go to hell." "I'm tired of hiding, Caleb. I want to walk down Main Street holding your hand." They rode into Copper Creek 2 days later. The town looked the same, but it felt different. They felt different. Sarah sat tall in her saddle, her chin high. Caleb rode close beside her, his father's gun on his hip. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. He was here to protect what was his. Mrs. Patterson saw them first. "Sarah McKinnon," she called out from the porch of the general store. "I heard you were dead." Sarah reined in her horse and looked down at the woman whose gossip had almost gotten her killed. Her voice was calm but cold as ice. "The reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Mrs. Patterson. No thanks to you." The woman had the decency to look away, her face flushing with shame. A tall, lean man with graying hair stepped out of the territorial office. A polished badge was pinned to his coat. Marshal Daniel Crawford. His handshake was firm. "Mr. McKinnon, Mrs. McKinnon," he said. "I'm glad you came. We have a few things to sort out." Inside the office, Crawford laid it all out. The charges were gone. The territorial government was offering Sarah compensation for her false imprisonment, and their marriage, forced upon them by Blackwood, was legally invalid. "However," he said, holding up a hand, "if you wish to remain married, I have the authority to perform a legitimate ceremony. Right here, right now." He pulled a file from his desk. "I've also reviewed the adoption records. There is no blood relation between you. Legally, there is no impediment to your marriage." The final weight lifted. Hearing it from a federal marshal made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Let them talk," Caleb said, his hand finding Sarah's. "We know who we are." Crawford smiled. "That's the right attitude, Mr. McKinnon. A love that's been through what yours has doesn't need anyone else's approval." The ceremony was simple. The marshal's clerk was the only witness, but their vows, the words they'd written during the long winter nights, filled the small room. "I take you not because I have to," Sarah said, her eyes locked on his, "but because I choose to, because you are the home my heart has been seeking." "I take you not to save you," Caleb replied, his voice thick with emotion, "but to love you, because you saved me first." When they walked out of that office, truly husband and wife, a crowd had gathered. But there were no jeers, no whispers, just curious, sympathetic faces. Their story had become a local legend. They weren't a scandal. They were survivors. The new land deed was for 2 acres on the edge of town, land that had been seized by Blackwood and was now being sold at cost to his victims. As Sarah signed her name, Sarah McKinnon, a commotion erupted in the street. 3 men in expensive suits were dismounting in front of the saloon. They stormed into the marshal's office. "Crawford!" the leader barked. "I'm Harrison Wade from the Colorado Mining Consortium. We're here to discuss the illegal seizure of our property." "The land was never legally yours, Mr. Wade," Crawford said calmly. "It was acquired through fraud and murder." Wade's eyes fell on Sarah. "You," he sneered, "the woman who was supposed to hang." The casual cruelty of his words sent a chill down Caleb's spine. These men knew exactly what Blackwood had done. They had paid for it. "The only lies," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet, "were the ones your judge told to steal land from honest people." Wade's hand went to his coat. but Crawford's voice was like steel. I wouldn't, Mr. Wade. You're in my jurisdiction now. Wade and his men left, spitting threats. Will there be trouble? Sarah asked. There's always trouble when that much money's involved, Crawford admitted, but they have no legal ground to stand on. Their power ended the day Judge Blackwood ran. Caleb pulled Sarah close. We're not running anymore, he said. We have the law, and we have each other. That's enough. Their real wedding rings were simple gold bands, made by the town blacksmith from nuggets Caleb had panned from the stream on their new property. They exchanged them on a crisp autumn morning, with only the mountains as their witness. 6 months had passed. Their house was built, a solid log home overlooking the stream. Sarah's bakery was thriving, its warm, sweet smells drawing in folks from all over the valley. The whispers had died down, replaced by a quiet respect. They had faced down a corrupt judge, a mining consortium, and the judgment of their own community, and they had won. One evening, as they walked along the stream, Sarah stopped. There was a new light in her eyes, a glow that had nothing to do with the setting sun. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. I'm carrying our child, she whispered. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. The world seemed to stop. A child, their child, a new beginning, born from an impossible choice. He couldn't speak. He could only pull her into his arms and hold her, his heart overflowing with a joy so fierce it felt like it might break him. 5 years later, Caleb stood in the doorway of their home. In the yard, their son Thomas was trying to skip stones across the stream. Their daughter Mary was chasing butterflies in a field of wildflowers, her laughter carrying on the wind. Sarah stood watching them, a peaceful smile on her face. The bakery was a success. The town had grown, and their love, forged in isolation and fear, had become the foundation of everything. They had proven that sometimes the most impossible choices lead to the most beautiful destinations. They had been given a choice between love and death, and they had been brave enough to choose both. If you enjoyed this story and you believe that love can find a way, even in the darkest of times, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because the stories we share here are a reminder that even when the world seems to be against you, courage and love can build a home anywhere.